All right. Well, Tom and I had so much fun the other day, we decided to do it again. Is this 2 days later or one day?
Oh, let's see. What is it? Today is
Yeah, it must be
Saturday,
two.
and it was Tuesday that we did it? No, it
Oh,
was
was it that
Thursday.
long?
No, it was Thursday.
Thursday.
Yeah.
Yeah, right,
hmm
right. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not Joe Rogan, so I don't go for the 3.5 hour
hmm
conversation necessarily. Well, I mean, I was drinking tea. I've got my giant Yeti teacup again,
hmm
and that's kind of a biological limit to how long I can go.
hmm
But one thing I wanted to thinking about our conversation and your trajectory through life, and we can get into more of the details that we didn't cover as much the other day. But I think one thing that keeps coming to mind for me is that maybe you can comment on, like, as I understood it, a big part of your journey has been a migration from maybe a sense of optimism and hope about technology and admiration for science and
hmm
admiration for the community of scientists that you were working with and all that, sort of migrating to a sense of frustration that they weren't seeing the big picture, that they weren't seeing the damage that's being done to the planet because everybody's in a very siloed kind of area of specialization and they're just,
hmm
keep their heads down and all that. But that's what you're describing is an existential crisis that I think a lot of us go through in our own ways. The feeling of, as a child, a feeling like, oh, adults know what they're doing and
Right.
everything's going to be okay. And then you become an adult and you realize adults have no fucking clue what they're
Right.
doing and
Nobody's
things
got
aren't.
this.
Yeah. Or you study, you feel like, my thing that you and I share, this sort of skepticism about the dominant myth of perpetual progress.
Right.
And then you study history or prehistory in my case, and you see, like, whoa, no, things aren't always getting better. This is a political thing. So there's this sort of sense of disillusionment that I think most intelligent adults have experienced as they've become intelligent adults. In your case, it's couched very much in a scientific vocabulary. But my question is, how do you keep your shit together? How do you stay mentally healthy when your perspective is not one of blind, ignorant bliss?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is this almost paradox that, I'm a naturally cheerful and optimistic person, and at some level you can't do the kinds of projects that I did without having a lot of optimism that, hey, this thing could work. Like
Mm,
I don't know what barriers might come, but I'll tackle them. I'll get through them. And you have to have some judgment about not getting into projects that are doomed to fail. So there's some of that goes on, but no, when it comes to the end of modernity and the collapse that I think has to unfold, which, could take generations to transpire. So I'm not envisioning the Hollywood version of this. But, that's very distressing. And it was distressing for me, but I always held on to optimism of some form. Now, optimism is often a form of denial. It's often a form of, magical thinking. And so I definitely had those versions and probably still do, but the target of my optimism has always shifted so that now my optimism comes out of a sense that life itself is rather amazing. The universe is rather amazing. We're lucky to be a part of it. And then I think crucially that modernity is not the same as humanity, that we
mm,
conflate those two and we think that a failure of modernity is a failure of humanity. And I started thinking about modernity as a cancer. It's a growth. It's a kind of this out of control tumor that's affecting all the living tissues on the planet at this point. It's metastasized. It's global. It's enormously big and harmful. It's causing a sixth mass extinction. It will kill its host if magically allowed to continue. Of course, all kinds of things will probably step in and intervene. But, you don't cheer for the cancer to win.
What
You
is the host in your metaphor? Is it
the
humanity
host
or Earth?
is humanity and Earth. I mean, there's sort of not much of a distinction between those for me. I think of really everything connected, inanimate and animate, both rely on each other. You know, our bodies, very few of the atoms in our bodies make it through our whole lives. We're continually washing through new elements. And so the pattern is remaining, but we rely on all this inanimate stuff. We rely on the sun as a part of who we are. You can't isolate us from it. You can't isolate us from all the rock on the earth in the earth that holds the air down that we breathe. So all of these pieces of in what we would call inanimate stuff is really part of the whole thing. And you can see life as kind of a fruiting body of a larger complex, a phenomenon that doesn't, you don't have any divisions where something is not a part of it. Everything is a part of everything. So there are connections between every bit. And when I'm saying this, I'm thinking about physics. I'm thinking about interactions, electromagnetic and gravitational. I mean, all of these things are really connected and interactive and in relationship all the time. And you can't shut it off and you can't draw a boundary. The boundaries are in our heads.
Do you think of yourself as a scientific mystic?
Um, I, eh, I don't know.
That's what you sound like to
I,
me. You're saying
I
the same
know I
thing the
do.
Dalai Lama says. You know, it's like, again, with the psychedelics, you're talking about
Yeah,
this unity and this integration and this, the living, the sort of how inanimate is actually a term that doesn't make sense in your
right,
worldview.
right.
It's a very
Eh,
mystical point of view, which I think Einstein kind of held as well, didn't he?
I don't know. I've never really studied what other people have thought about this so much, but yeah, I find myself surprisingly at home with some of these, as you call, mystical, spiritual concepts. I'm very close to being an animist in some sense, even though it all comes from what any hardcore physicist would recognize as the same base.
Mm,
So, it's they're not incompatible
right.
like you might assume they are. Physics has spent and science has spent so much of its adolescence smashing things apart and trying to figure out what makes them and what makes them tick. And we've learned a tremendous amount through that. But it's also possible to sort of get tired of smashing and see what is it all, how does it all work together? And it's unassailably true that basically every particle in the universe feels every other particle within its causal, light travel time, what's called the past light cone. I mean, at infinitesimally small degree, but it's there are no real boundaries. The entire thing is this interactive phenomenon. And yeah, so the host here is it, you can sort of call it what you will. The whole system is sick with modernity right now, the Earth system, but the living community of life certainly, and humans are the real carrier. So if you think about cancer starts in an organ in the body, and it's basically an organ whose cells, or it starts probably with one cell that goes rogue. Some mutation, some cosmic ray, something knocks a piece of genetic coding sideways, and suddenly it becomes growth obsessed. And so the organ itself becomes a real problem for the entire community of organs in the organism that all work together and all have relationships, and you don't ever see any one of them isolated like a kidney walking down the street. Never happens. So they all need each other. They're all in this relationship. One goes rogue, but then it starts impinging on its neighbors. And all of those interactions that the neighbors rely on from it, all this reciprocal interaction gets subverted and distorted and shut down, and the organism can't keep going. And so modernity is acting like that cancer. It took root in the organ that is the human species. The human species is like one component of a larger set of life of species that all act together as a type of organism with all kinds of relationships that we don't even know, we haven't tracked. Um, and so, yeah, it's a disease that started in humans and has afflicted us greatly to the point that 99.7, I'm making up the number, but some very large fraction of humans are in its grip. basically participating in a market economy. That's one way to see whether to ask, are you in the grip of modernity? Do you use money? That's a good way to to
Right.
describe it or to capture it. So yeah, we're afflicted. It's a disease. If we got rid of it, we could still be healthy.
Do you, in this metaphor, do you see any immunological response?
I mean, so when I think of that metaphor, I think, the immunological response typically comes from outside that organ. It's, antibodies and white blood cells. And so, are there other elements of this system that are trying to shut this down, that are trying to at least communicate it's a bad idea? And definitely the seeing species go extinct, that's a warning signal that something is badly out of line. There will be things that, whether we want it or not, will shut down modernity because it's a very materials hungry enterprise. And
Right.
we've basically taken the low hanging fruit from around the world. Copper mines used to get 10% ore grade, and now it's less than 0.5%. And
Right.
so we've found all the easy deposits, and materials limits alone and energy issues alone will shut down modernity as a kind of antibody that prevents it from sailing into infinity.
Right. I'm thinking lots of different things like, inherent limits, like you're describing with materials, but also things like topsoil depletion,
Mm-hmm.
where, we're actually spending more energy to fertilize the soil that we've destroyed than we're getting out in terms of caloric content.
Yep.
We're in these, diminishing return loops where
Right.
we've, in several cases, passed the point of surplus return. We're putting more energy in than we're getting out.
By a factor
Also,
of
think,
10 to 1, by the way, our agricultural practice, for every calorie that we get
is
off
that
the
how bad it is?
off the plate,
Jesus.
yeah, it requires 10 calories of input, but we're subsidizing it from fossil fuels, basically.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's you can temporarily play that game. And
Yeah.
that's what we're doing. And that's why we have 8 billion people, is that we're temporarily borrowing this surplus that got stored for millions of years, and we're converting it into a few 100-year spree
Yeah.
because party time,
And the story about the guy, I forget his name. I think it was German or Austrian, the scientist who figured out how to, what is it?
The Haber-Bosch method.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, who then his science was used to create the gas that killed the Jews in
Mm-hmm.
Germany, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like this guy, through those two inventions, is probably going to be responsible for the greatest loss of life in the history of our
Oh, for sure.
species.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there are diminishing returns. There are natural sort of physical limitations in terms of materials. Um, the oceans can only be overfished for so long before you have complete collapse and of fisheries and so on. What about things like things that are inherent to technological progress, like the Fermi paradox?
Mm-hmm.
Would you explain briefly to the listeners? The Fermi paradox is essentially the idea that when astrophysicists look at the universe and the number of stars and the number of planets that seem to be at the right distance from the right size stars and do all the calculations, it seems inevitable that there would be millions of planets on which life would have evolved and life would have just sort of naturally reached some sort of technological intelligence and developed technology. So where the fuck is everyone? And what Fermi proposed is that there's something inherent in technological development where it goes faster than intellectual or the development of wisdom. So any intelligent life form always ends up with technology that's far more powerful than its ability to control the technology. So it destroys itself. And that's
Hmm.
why we haven't seen evidence of other intelligence. I don't know if you disagree with my description of the paradox, please correct me if you do.
Yeah, no, that's basically right. Why haven't we heard from anybody? That's the paradox. The calculations would show that it should be essentially inevitable that, life should be abundant. I mean, our galaxy alone has 100 billion stars, and we're finding that almost all stars have planet systems. You know, as we've developed the technology and the capacity to sense that there are wobbles and other, eclipsing and other kinds of techniques. So it seems to be ubiquitous in life, even if it's only 1 in 1,000, that's 100 million instances of life in our galaxy. Or if it's 1 in 1 million, you've still got 100,000. So, I mean, it's just the
Yeah.
numbers are so huge. Why don't we hear from anybody? And I think, let's not get ahead of ourselves in the sense that we have only been transmitting for, 100 years or something in that ballpark,
Yeah.
radio and TV and so forth. That's nothing. That's such a blink, right? And so timescales are really important. I mean, the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Our solar system is about 4.5 billion years old. Humans have existed in all homogeneous forms have existed for about 3 million years. And that's about 1/5000th the age of the universe. So that's already tiny. And then I've played this game that helps me. Large timescales are hard to get your head around. We don't have
Yeah.
direct contact with it. So I played this little game of saying, let's equate the 3 million years humans have been on the planet to a timescale we can comprehend, which is a human lifetime.
Mhm.
So lifetime of humans, map it to a human lifetime. There's some, sense in doing that. Homo sapiens has been around for only the last 5 years of, say, a 75-year life. We've only been doing agriculture for the last 3 or 4 months. So it's like a new hobby that this 75-year-old picked up and isn't really very good at it yet. I mean, it takes a
Right.
long time to get good at something. In the last 4 days, we've had science in this sort of, that's 400 years, the last 400 years of science as we know it today. In the last day and a half of this 75-year life, we've been using fossil fuels. And in the last 12 hours of this 75-year life, we have chewed through, over half of the animal population on the planet, and extinction rates have gone up. And that's just, that human lifetime is only the last 3 million years, which is tiny on cosmic timescales. And so this is such a fleeting moment that we, because of our weird little perspectives in these short-lived, flashes of life that represent our own decades on this planet, accept our conditions as normal.
Yeah.
Yet it's the most blatantly abnormal period in Earth's history.
Yeah. Have you read
And
The Long Summer?
no.
It's, I think I cited in Civilized to Death. I forget the author's name, but it's about what's the word for this? Earth climate, over the long scale.
Hmm.
And he makes exactly, the whole book is making the point that you just made, that the last 10,000 years have been extremely unusual in terms of climate. And it's only this extremely unusual period that has allowed agriculture to develop and human population to,
Right,
explode. And all the stuff we're talking about has
right.
happened within this minuscule, very unlikely, very strange, anomalous moment
Yep,
in geological history. And I mean, that in itself is, I would say, an immunological response, right?
right. I mean,
Ice
yeah,
ages are coming.
the conditions set up to make us susceptible to this disease. It hit with great force and great speed,
Yeah.
and it went metastatic, and now it's threatening the entire, it's threatening a sixth mass extinction. It's threatening the entire collapse of the living host. And that's pretty serious. I mean, sixth mass extinction, a mass extinction is when 75% of species fail, but it's really hard to stomp out life, period, on Earth. So and life will re-evolve and adapt to a new situation, and you'll get more, an increase of biodiversity after this big bottleneck. And so, it's not quite as dramatic as cancer, which kills the host, and that also kills the cancer, by the way. So cancer is not part of an ecology. It's not an evolved life form of its own because it has no reproductive strategy. You don't transmit cancer. It's something that's a one-off. It's a mutation. It's something that happens to somebody's cells and ends itself. That cancer dies with its
It's
host.
right. It's ultimately self-destructive.
That's right. And so modernity
Right.
has to also be self-destructive. There is no continuing modernity through a six-mass extinction. It kills itself for sure.
Hmm. So Brian Fagan is the name of the author. It
Okay.
always comes to me in a 30-second lag. There's like a Doppler effect to my memory. Reading that book, I was struck by something. I wonder how you feel about this, because he was talking about ice ages and the sort of regularity with which ice ages occurred in the past. And right now we're overdue for an ice age. And I had a climate scientist on years ago, a really nice guy. I forget his name. He lived in San Diego, and he contacted me because I said something on the podcast that wasn't accurate. And he was like, "Look, I'm a scientist. You said
Mm-hmm.
this. It's actually that." And we had his correspondence, and then I went to his place in San Diego, and wonderful guy. Met his family, had dinner. It was really nice. It was
Mm-hmm.
one of those wonderful podcasting experiences. But he made the point that global warming could actually be strangely accidentally beneficial in the sense that we're overdue for an ice age, and the carbon that we've put into the atmosphere may be the only thing that's stopping Scandinavian countries from being under a mile of ice right now.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there are some downsides to that as
Yeah,
well.
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
Nothing
definitely.
against the Scandinavians, but
Hey, sorry, Sweden.
yeah,
I got to take one for the team here.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just imagine the havoc that'll be, impact global everything. I mean, the ocean currents, the big current that brings warm water up from the Caribbean will stop,
Mm-hmm.
and then Europe just drops in temperature dramatically over a decade, and just forget about agriculture in Ukraine, and which is
Mm-hmm.
the breadbasket of a lot of the world right now. Anyway, point being that I was in a forest. I was reading this book, The Long Summer, and I grew up, as you probably did, with a sense of environmental awareness. And the message that the environmental movement taught me as a kid was that the natural world is this delicate balance, and everything is interacting in a very sort of fine-tuned way. And we come in and we overhunt a particular species, and then everything goes out of whack and everything
Mm-hmm.
gets, out of balance and distorted. And what I was looking around at this forest, and while I was reading the book, I was thinking, yeah, but 10,000 years ago, this forest wasn't here. None of it was here.
Mm.
This was, like I look around Beetle Kill here in Colorado where I live. You see these forests getting wiped out, giant fires, volcanic eruptions, like these huge climactic events that we see as terrible, horrible things. They're part of the whole, they're just part of
Mm-hmm.
the trip. That's just the way the earth is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it led me to kind of revise, like to see some of my thinking about the environment as being kind of precious. Like this shit gets wiped out and comes back to life over and over and over again. And it's only in my human time scale where I look at this and say, oh, we're logging these forests, and, we're killing the brown trout with the soil runoff into the streams. And this is such a terrible thing. And it is. I don't mean to take anything away from the environmental movement, but on the other hand, 10,000 years ago, there was no stream, there were no trout, there wasn't even a forest here. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So it's the time
maybe. I
scale
mean,
thing.
it depends. some places there would have been for, even
Sure.
millions of years.
Yeah.
And yeah, I hear what you're saying, and it's often mistaken when you say, wow, look at the disruption we're making, we're causing. This point will come up that, well, it changes all the time. And yes, but not in 100 years. Not, these things are more gradual. And what's most important to me is that, species typical lifetime is something like 1 million years. That ballpark comes and goes and evolves, and some last a lot longer than that and some shorter than that. But that's a characteristic time frame. And over that time frame, climate does change a lot, and species adapt to it. And basically what that means is they have phenotypes in their genome that are already wired to accommodate certain conditions, so that, just in natural diversity among a species, you've got some, take, I guess the example that leaps to mind is something that I think has been the canonical example of a moth in Britain that had phenotypes that could be light or dark.
Right.
And so, you'd have a variety of different moths, but the darker ones started to do better in the oil or the coal soot
Coal.
kind of covered surfaces. And so pretty soon those outcompeted the lighter ones, and you had dark moths, all the same species. And they had these different capabilities kind of already built in for different varying conditions. And so species that last for a million or millions of years have seen a lot of variations and can turn on or off various traits according to, just through selection over a few generations. It can happen. So the evolution, you don't have to wait for evolution to catch up if it's already cooked into that time frame. Okay.
Yeah. That's
But
almost a Lamarckian perspective,
mm,
you know, which is interesting because it is coming back. Lamarck was totally derided once Darwin came to the fore, even though Darwin respected his research, as if I remember correctly. But the idea of that it's not just natural selection that leads to these changes, there's an innate adaptability that can be triggered through epigenetics or other
hmm
means.
hmm
You don't need to just die and wait for future generations to have that trait. It can actually be within the species, within the individual.
or certainly within the reproductive capability, so that the offspring that have more of this trait will do better. And so the
Right.
individual doesn't necessarily have to change, but
That's
as long as
the
you've got the
Darwinian.
library,
Yeah.
yeah, you've
Right.
got the library of all that change. Now, modernity is doing things that aren't part of anybody's evolutionary history.
Microplastics.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Here's the other one kind of perspective that I enjoy thinking about. Our bodies, if you count up all the atoms in our bodies, 99.1% of them, and I'm not making up the number this time, 99.1% of the atoms in your body are derived from air and water. So you've obviously got a lot of hydrogen and oxygen, and that's water, oxygen from the air.
Hmm.
The carbon is from plants that sometimes animals eat, and we eat the animals, sometimes we eat the plants, but that comes from carbon dioxide in the air. And then nitrogen is fixed by plants and bacteria, but grabbed out of the air ultimately. And so we're almost all air and water, which is really remarkable. That's kind of incredible. It's a great magic trick to turn air and water into life. And you need some things like calcium and phosphorus and magnesium and a few things at much smaller levels. And these minerals are common currency in the community of life and get recycled. And that's part of the cleverness. I mean, life basically found ways to utilize just the physics and the, like, hey, there are photons. What can we do with those? What gives me an advantage? Some photoreceptor that now can tell the presence of light. Hey, that gives me some advantage, and there you go. So it's utilizing what physics provides and the materials that are in common circulation and easy to access. But most of the materials we use for modernity, if you look at your cell phone, your computer, your house, okay, house has wood, but your car, whatever. There are a lot of materials there that really just aren't part of that life process.
Right.
And so we dig them from the depths and we're spewing them around the planet. And if you're lucky, they don't cause harm, but more often than not, it's not good for life to incorporate these, alien elements that are now abundant and spread.
All right, so let me play devil's advocate here,
Mm-hmm.
because I've had this conversation like with my favorite uncle who just died.
Mm.
Shouldn't say my favorite uncle. If any other uncles are listening to this, sorry, he just died. So
Okay.
he's
That
my
made him
favorite
your
at the
favorite.
moment.
Let's just say that.
My favorite dead uncle. Anyway, he was kind of a right winger, and he loved arguing with me about this stuff. But his response to that would be like, Chris, it's all natural.
Mm-hmm.
We're part of the natural environment.
Mm-hmm.
Anything we do, anything we create, anything we invent and synthesize is by extension part of
Mm-hmm.
nature.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
I say absolutely true. Nothing in the universe is unnatural. It's all part of the universe. But that doesn't mean that the community of life is adapted to every possible scenario. And what I instantly go to always is a total nuclear annihilation would be completely natural. I mean, that's just something the universe can do. The universe can make an organism that can create nuclear bombs and blow itself to smithereens. And so what? Do you shrug just because it's the universe? I don't. And so you have to come in with something else, some value. You have to value life, for instance. If you don't value life and just think, barren, rocky, icy planet is every bit as part of the universe as the Earth, and so there's no difference.
Well, but
I,
how long would it
I
be
say there is a
barren and
difference.
rocky and icy, right? I mean, it was barren, rocky, and icy before the first life forms were
Right.
here. I mean, the way you're describing life is really interesting. And I agree with it. Like you're talking about life saying, "Oh, there are these photons. What can I do with that?" And sort of and taking advantage of this
Mm-hmm.
energy in the universe, and that's borne out by the fact that the eye, as far as I understand it, evolved independently
Mm-hmm.
in different organisms in different parts of the world in different times.
Yeah.
So it's exactly as you're describing. It's not like some lucky mutation that then was so beneficial that it spread throughout life. It actually is life in a dispersed sense, recognizing and adapting to something in its environment. When you describe life that way, it sounds to me like physics. It sounds like
Mm-hmm.
an innate, like the way in our last conversation we were talking about, I asked you if mathematics and physics is discovered or invented, and you made a very good argument that it's discovered. It exists. Any life form would have found these
Mm-hmm.
formulas
Mm-hmm.
eventually. Isn't life itself then like these formulas? It's
Yeah.
something that is innate to material reality.
Yeah, and my last name is Murphy, so Murphy's Law, if something can go wrong, it will. I'm often accused when something goes wrong. But my version of it is if something can happen, don't be surprised when it does. You have no reason to be surprised. And so
Right.
if life can happen, if life can exploit some physical property, don't be surprised when it was. It doesn't guarantee that it will, but you just can't be surprised when it does, and there's some adaptive advantage that promotes that particular trick.
So, what's the adaptive advantage to life emerging from an inanimate universe?
Well, yeah, I think in a sense it sounds circular, but like circular reasoning, another name for circular reasoning is self-consistent, though, and so I don't really back away from circular reasoning. Once you have something that can self-replicate, you're off to the races, and it just will. And you shouldn't be surprised that it does. And once it does, you'll get all these advantages. So there's not what's the fancy word, teleology or something. There's no purpose for it, but it can, so it did. And
Hmm. So
no big surprise.
So you don't agree with Carl Sagan's vision that life is the universe looking back at itself?
I don't think that that's what there was any aim for that to happen, but it could happen, and so I'm not surprised that it did. And it's
On a,
it's
on
it's
a
cool
large
to be
enough,
part of that.
yeah. And, if, as you say, if it can happen, don't be surprised if it does. And if you take the non-zero possibility of it happening and you combine that with
Eons.
yeah, eons,
Yeah.
then it will. Then it's
Yeah.
certain that it will eventually,
Yeah.
right?
Somewhere.
Yeah.
Right.
Somewhere, somehow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did a podcast with a guy named Bruce Damer years ago. It's really fascinating. I think he's an astrophysicist as well and a mystic. I'll send you the link to that episode. That was
Yeah.
really he's a very interesting guy, and he worked at NASA designing spacecraft and he was on the committee to choose the landing site on Mars, a lot of like high-end stuff.
Mhm.
Um but his way of I asked him, where does this knowledge come from? Like how do you know like where to land a spacecraft on Mars or how to design a spacecraft or whatever? And he described this state of consciousness that he can access where he feels it's like entering a library where there's all knowledge, and he can enter the library through his consciousness and just know things. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. I know, back to Einstein again, I know Einstein talked about working on a problem and he couldn't figure it out. And then he would have a dream and the answer
Mhm.
would appear in his
Mhm.
dream.
Yeah.
Newton was a very mystical, magical thinker. Kepler, Copernicus, all these guys were, they were alchemists. They were looking for this mysterious way to transform material. But have you ever felt that? Have you ever felt like there's something mystical in your knowledge or your connection to knowledge?
I mean, definitely I'm familiar with flashes of insight that seem to come from nowhere, but I call our our kind of what we call a conscious experience. It's kind of a spare capacity on top of hell of a lot of neural activity. And I looked at a study recently about the bandwidth of thought, of conscious thought, and of problem solving, and on a variety of tasks like playing video games or solving a Rubik's cube or typing or reading or speaking, whatever. And it always comes out to something like in the neighborhood of 10 to 50 bits per second of information processing, whereas our brains are actually processing like a billion bits per second in terms of visual field and auditory and sensory and all these kinds of things. Um, and so we're only really aware of a tiny fraction of the neural activity in our brains. And that awareness is not some external agent or some disconnected helmsman. It's the prefrontal cortex that's in contact with all the other parts of the brain for a specific reason to provide inhibitory kind of judgment on no, no, don't do this yet. Don't, like,
Right.
let's think about this. And so that's the sort of seat of it in our brains. And it's still just a process. And so when this insight comes out of nowhere, well, it was happening in your brain and it's still a mental model. And you just sort of, it flashed into the part of your circuitry that is, has that awareness program running, if you will. And so there's nothing, to me, mystical about that. It's amazing. It's well beyond our grasp to understand how it happens, but you don't need something more exotic than physics and neurochemistry and a hell of a lot of complexity and interconnection to have it happen. So, and most ideas are wrong. So most insights, in fact, are also wrong.
Yeah. We don't
But
talk about them.
but the ones that survive because the universe says, yeah, that one's okay.
You had a great line in one of your recent pieces where you said, truth is discovered by life, not created by it.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a
Yeah.
very succinct way to put it, and kind of like ties a bow on a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of, yeah,
Yeah,
what,
discovered by and exploited by life, and so I think, the whole point about, what's natural and not natural, and what and who cares. So life has a process by which it adapts and it you know evolves, and that takes time. It's a slow process, but there's been a lot of time, unimaginable amounts of time, so that life is continually testing, hey, does this work? No, that doesn't work. Does this work? Yeah, that's doing okay. And so you build up, you accumulate this ratcheting set of complexity that is pre-vetted to work. If it doesn't work, it's not here. And so there's a wisdom in all of that. And I don't think that wisdom really can come out of our brains so much as the universe itself has expressed a type of wisdom just through the fact that these complex systems survive and adapt and persist, so that I don't want to second guess the way, an animal or a plant reacts to a particular situation, because it does that only because it has that reaction, only because the history of the planet and its own evolutionary heritage and its own experiences have shaped it to do those things. And we're no different. We're making our decisions based on, um, all the way back to how an amoeba reacts to things. That's still part of who we are, but all the way up to, how everything along our evolutionary line, reptiles and mammals, we have that programming, if you will, that is there because it works and it's survived. But when so the difference is we come up with things out of our brains, and that's where the trouble starts, because our brains make simplified mental models. That's what they're here for, that are often decent and adaptive and, confer some advantages, but they are incapable of understanding the complete context and the complete complexity of a real, say, ecological situation. And so our brains say, hey, what if we do this? That looks fun. That looks advantageous to us, without possibly understanding the ramifications.
but isn't that true of all species? You seem to be setting up a dichotomy between the limitations of the human brain creating all these problems, but the limitation of a beaver's brain that decides to dam up this stream, thereby creating all sorts of conditions that it has no means of understanding. That's part of nature. So this is
Mm-hmm.
getting back to my favorite dead uncle, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why is the beaver part of this, elegant, balanced symphony of nature, and we're crashing the cymbal at the wrong time and ruining everything? Aren't we part of the same symphony?
Yeah. And I think that it's a very good point. My instant reaction is symbolic language and writing have allowed us to sort of rigidify and and cast into some concrete, lasting form thoughts that, the beaver might have fleetingly, but don't get locked into a coordinated, coherent, sort of species wide kind of action. And I think those mechanisms that came out of, there's some adaptive advantage to being able to communicate symbolically.
Huge,
Yeah.
apparently huge.
Right, but maladaptive now, right? I mean, in the rear view, will it be called adaptive if it is what causes humans to go extinct? Because evolution is going to try all kinds of experiments on every front. There are advantages in size, in color, in strength, in both directions, being really big or really small. You have advantages all across the board. Intelligence is just one of many directions in which one might push. And as with any adaptation, you can take it too far, and you only know when it has gone too far. Now, what gives me hope in all this is that humans have lived on the planet for a very long time without doing this modernity, post-agricultural mode. Most of our time on the planet was not doing this, and it was also not writing, right? And so I
Yeah.
think that's a big piece of it. So we're not inherently slated to be the planet killers, but it can happen, so it shouldn't surprise us when it does. It can also happen that we can have cultural practices and beliefs that form a restraint, and that restraint is important to keep us from doing things so fast that the rest of the community of life can't keep up with them. I mean, that's the real crux of the problem, is that we transform things on such fast timescales that the plants and animals can't possibly evolve, and they don't have the phenotypes based on, oh, we've seen civilizations come and go before and we can tolerate this. No, this is all new and so fast that the community of life can't keep up, and that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the concept of spandrels in anthropology and
No.
evolution? It's a great concept. You're going to love it. It's from an essay by Stephen Jay Gould and Levontin, I think his name was, called The Spandrels of San Marco. So San Marco is this little church in Italy that they saw. And you know how in an arch, so a medieval arch, you have the sort of semicircle, but the structure is actually rectangular, right? You have the walls coming up and a cross piece,
Mm-hmm.
but they build the arch within that rectangle. And so in the
Mm-hmm.
corners, you have this empty space because
Mm-hmm.
the arch is decorative. The actual weight is being held by the cross piece, the
Mm-hmm.
beam. And you have these empty spaces in the corner where the arch cuts the corner. And so in medieval times, they used that area called the spandrel to make these incredible dragons and these beautiful shapes and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at it now, it looks like that was intentional, like, oh, they designed it to put those things there. But in fact, it was just this space that came sort of coincidentally because of the needs of the aesthetics versus the needs of the physics.
Right.
And so
And
in
they
this
probably
essay,
thought, we're tired of spiders building webs in those things. What can we do to?
exactly. Yeah, or
Yeah.
birds' nests, right? Or
Yeah.
whatever. So they filled it in. So what Gould and his co-author sort of co-opted the term to refer to things in evolution that they're traits that scientists look at and say, well, how did that develop? How did that evolve? What's the purpose for that? But in fact, there was no purpose. It was a byproduct of some other
Mm-hmm.
evolutionary process.
Mm-hmm.
So I think an example they use in the essay would be that, the nose evolved to hold eyeglasses or something like that. You
Right.
come up with all these just so stories. But the reason I ask is that there are some scientists who have argued that the brain itself, the neocortex and the sort of high, power human brain is a spandrel,
Mm.
that the brain did not evolve in order to give us, higher processing power to, be constantly aware of social arrangements or, hunting or whatever advantage. That what happened was, I forget the name of the scientist who first proposed this, but his hypothesis was that in the environment of ancient times in Africa, a million years ago or more, uh, well, actually, no, it would have been more like, I think, 50 to 60,000 years ago is when the great explosion of brain capacity seemed to happen. But that's art. No, I'm sorry. I'm getting mixed up. The cranium size explosion was a couple million years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point is, his theory is that we were chasing game and our brains would get overheated. So evolution preferred redundancy in the brain. We developed, some of our ancestors had redundant brain centers so that when part of the brain got overheated and couldn't function, other regions could take over that function and the person could keep functioning, keep, hunting and running or whatever they were doing. And so it's almost like we set up, like a car has a spare engine because the primary engine shuts down sometimes. And then somehow it managed to merge the two engines and now became a very, very fast car.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But the idea was never, let's have a bigger engine. The idea was, let's have a backup engine.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. And, all brains, basically, as far as, you can go pretty far down the evolutionary tree, are split
Right.
bicameral.
Right.
And that has great adaptive advantage in being able to attend to two different things. And typically one attends to the close, the local, what you're going to manipulate, what you're going to eat, and that's often the left hemisphere. And then the right hemisphere, more broad, to pay attention to any threat that might be coming, and you don't want to prejudge what that threat might be. You need to be open to sort of what it is as it is and not have some model. So it's a less model dependent version of thinking. And so definitely we've had those two sides. And so that's definitely a real thing. I'm not sure about the other, but it's an interesting idea. I
And the
would have to
brain is
look
sort of
into it.
layered, right? I mean, aside from the left and the right and the corpus callosum connecting them and all that,
Mhm.
there's the ancient brain in the back, and then there are like sort of evolutionary layers that have been added over time. Yeah, it's so you're a right brain physicist. That's a pretty rare breed.
Well, yeah, that's something that I came to realize. I read Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, which I thought was really fascinating. And started to realize why I was as different as I am from many of my colleagues and instructors, because I always emphasize the contextual connections to all kinds of things in life, how we see physics happening in all kinds of, and I'm not saying that I was alone in that way, but yeah, I think that I've developed, I think, more in that direction since realizing that there's a kind of a flaw to just considering logic and algorithm and certainty as the only way to think. That's what's reinforced, that's what's rewarded, that's what our culture has really run with. But being able to accept a wider, more holistic, contextual, ambiguous, multiple things true at once. Paradoxes are usually a limitation of some contextual framing. And so I've definitely tried to pay more attention to that kind of thinking, which as I do, I find that other cultures, especially indigenous cultures and animistic cultures, are much more comfortable in that mode of thinking. And I think there's really something to that because it basically admits we don't know everything, right? Animism is there are spirits moving everything, rivers and rocks and trees and mice and everything. And that's a way of acknowledging that there are a lot of forces and interactions here that we're not tracking, that we're not that aren't part of our explicit mental model. And it's kind of a humility of we don't have all the answers, but we know what we see and we believe what we see. This is the universe as it actually exists. And it doesn't have to be our model of the universe that becomes the primary reality. That's a
Mm.
very dim reflection of a much broader, much more complex, much more inscrutable set of realities.
Do you think that insight that you've just described, the insight that reality, that our understanding of reality is looking through a tiny little window
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
at what reality actually is,
mm-hmm.
do you think that insight is eroding culturally? Because I do. I
I do
feel
too.
like
Yeah.
young people have less of an understanding, and that's why I was struck by your quote. Truth is discovered by life, not created by it. I feel like there's a sense in which we do create our sense of truth unconsciously because of cultural norms and
Mm-hmm,
the family we grew up in and the language we speak and the moment in history in which we live and all that. But I feel like I don't know, is this the Enlightenment or what it is that gave us this sense of like, no, it's bigger than that. That
mm-hmm.
you have a biased view on what is real.
Yeah.
But I feel like something about screens and social media and algorithms is making that insight more distant and more difficult.
I agree. And one place I saw this really show up is when I wrote this textbook for a class on energy and the environment. I was previewing it for students, and once it was published, I was still gathering feedback on how they were reacting to this book, and it was really valuable feedback. But one thing that was common that many students said is, "We don't like the way you're doing math in this book." I said, "Okay, what do you mean?" They said, "Well, we don't like it when you have words, 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 an equation, words, 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 equation, words, words, words." I said, "Well, okay, there's a reason I'm doing that, but what would you prefer?" And they said, "Well, we would like all the math separated into a box in a stepwise kind of recipe, so that when we find a problem in the back of the book, or in the back of the chapter, we will have a template to go by. And then we basically, they didn't use these words, but then we don't have to understand what's going on. We can just follow the steps and
Right.
put in the numbers that are particular to that problem and work our way through in parallel, doing the operations, multiplying and dividing, and whatever this thing is doing." And I tried to, make the case for my style, which is the equations, think of that as just a sentence, and it's expressing something, and it's expressing a lot of relationships, and the text around it is trying to draw out that relationship and put context to it.
Mm.
And that it's not part of an algorithm, but textbooks, they wanted it to be separated like this because that's what textbooks have typically done. That's what they're used to. And part of that is the customer is always right. Textbooks that students like and think the problems are easier, or, they rate higher, get more traction. And textbooks are constantly trying to satisfy students, and students are looking for an easier path. And so we have stressed algorithmic thinking and learning, and so it does become a recipe and not this quest to understand the concepts. And so when students would come to my office wanting to figure out how to do a problem, I would always step back and say, "Okay, well, here's the concept that you need to really understand." And then the problem becomes easy. And they were like, "Yeah, but I just want to know how to do this problem."
Mm.
And so I'm trying to craft a master key that will open all the doors in the hallway.
Right. Right.
And it takes a little more time and a little more effort. And they're impatient with that. And they're like, "No, no, no. I want a key just to this door."
Right.
I'm like, "But what I'm doing will unlock any problem of this type. And when you get to the exam, you're not going to be stymied by not having seen this problem before."
Right.
And when it really hit home is our institution at UC San Diego has a department, or not a department, but an entity called academic integrity. So, looking after cheating and that kind of thing. So it's AI, which is, great foreshadowing that now their main concern is AI, artificial intelligence. And they issued a statement at one point to instructors about how to manage and how to deal with all this, influx of AI intrusion into the student work. And they said, "Remember, these large language model programs were trained to complete sentences. They don't know how to think. They don't know how to analyze. They don't know how to tell truth from fiction." And it hit me that, gosh, our students,
Exactly.
a lot of them are
Yeah.
exactly formed in this same mold. And
Yeah.
and so I even wrote that sentence up on the board and said, "Don't be like this. You'll beat AI if you aren't thinking algorithmically, and if you're not locked into patterns, and you're not, that you can think and analyze and tell truth from fiction." So, but the truth is that we have taken, our educational system has, in any mass production effort is going to look to systematize. And in doing so, we've really taken the heart out of what real learning is, so that everybody can follow a stepwise program, and it becomes more and more detached from how the actual world works.
It is, uh, I feel like it is a characteristic of human intelligence that we invent systems and then become an appendage of the system,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Like I forget what book this is, but there's a book that looks at how human psychology has reflected the technology of the era. So in the late 1800s, scientists were describing the mind as like a pump system or a steam engine
Mhm.
kind of,
Mhm.
pressure builds up here and is released over here. And then, it becomes circuitry, it
Mhm.
becomes a computer in the 50s and 60s. And,
Mhm.
and now it's algorithms and,
Mhm.
so our understanding of ourselves and of reality itself becomes shaped by the means with which, the instruments we're using to measure it, right?
Mhm.
You've referred a couple of times to language as having been a Rubicon that was
Yeah.
crossed.
Right.
I don't know if you've read a book called The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abrams, where he makes that argument explicitly that I think in his case, he's saying written language in particular
Mhm.
was a moment when we stepped away from reality into a world of symbolic reality.
Yeah.
Now we're making marks that mean a thing. And the
Right.
first marks replicated the thing. So the mark for house looked like a little house, kind of like Chinese alphabet or
Or
um
cuneiform, had this kind of
yeah,
symbolic
right. And now it's totally
pictures.
divorced. Now it's just
Right.
kind of randomized.
Well, to the point that we use letters, and the letters themselves don't have intrinsic meaning, but
Right.
in combination they acquire some, assigned meaning, but
Yeah.
not something that you don't look at the word and without having been exposed to any similar language know from its form, anything
And
about it. So it's very
numbers.
divorced.
As you said, with your textbook, it's words and formulas, and this is all
Mhm.
just language. This is all part of
Mhm.
communicating symbolically.
Mhm.
So I wonder, do you feel the same? Is there a similar alienating effect of mathematics when we started thinking, when zero was invented by the Moors and, or
Careful about invented.
yeah, a good point. Exactly.
Mhm. There are animals that have a
Recognized
concept of zero.
crows.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Corvids are super, super smart.
Right.
And it's interesting. I've never read anyone talk about why crows and ravens would have a use for that cognitive capacity that
Mhm.
other similar animals wouldn't.
Well, and I suspect that it's more universal than our experiments can elucidate.
Uh, that's a good way to say
I
it.
mean, we,
Yeah.
we have a very limited capability that's very difficult to get inside the mind of any other
Yeah.
animal or plant
Yeah.
or amoeba, so
Right.
yeah, I wouldn't put it past I wouldn't deprive anybody, any living being of having some concept of that. Who am I to say they don't? I mean, prove it.
Yeah.
It's useful.
I had an idea for a
There's no
book.
food there. That's
Yeah.
important.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I had an idea for a book years ago, which I never really followed up on, but it came about because, when I was researching sex at dawn, I spent a lot of time talking with biologists and evolutionary scientists. And I realized that there were really basic things that they didn't understand,
Hmm.
that nobody understood.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh,
like
for
I,
sure.
I remember asking Franz Duvall, who's you probably read some of his books. He's a primatologist. I remember, I think it was in a podcast with him. I said to him, Franz, what is a species? Because my
Mm,
understanding of a species is that it's two animals that can't mate and have fertile offspring, right? That's the textbook definition.
hmm.
But you're saying bonobos and chimps can mate and can have fertile offspring,
Hmm.
then how are they separate species? And he sort of paused. He was Dutch. And he paused and he said, Chris, never ask a biologist to define species.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, you have hybridizing all over the place, and um, it's more lines that we draw in our head.
Well, it's
These
kind
are
of like what,
artificial distinctions.
yeah, it's like you and I were talking about gravity the other day,
Hmm.
right? Which is like a fundamental characteristic of the physical universe.
Hmm.
But if I remember correctly, we kind of agreed that nobody actually knows how the hell it works.
No. Or if you ask any physicist what is an electron, you'll get a first answer. And then if you probe deeper and deeper, yeah, but what do you mean by that?
Right.
Eventually you're just going to get, well, that's what appears and that's how it behaves.
Right.
And these are the characteristics. But nobody knows what it is or why it has the properties it does. That's just what we're handed.
Right. And it's limited by the same thing you just described with species, right? I don't have the elegance of your phrase at hand, but that we are limited by our ability to investigate
Yeah.
the thing, right? So
Yeah.
electron could be many other things that we aren't capable of perceiving at this point.
Well, and in fact, an electron is surrounded by this cloud of virtual particles that polarize around it and shield its charge a little bit. And so you never have just an electron. It's always got
Virtual
this.
particles.
Yeah, that's a real thing. Virtual is real.
Or is it?
Yeah, no, you see it. I mean, this is an example where because the electron, say a simple hydrogen atom, the electron spends some of its time in a static, what we call a stationary state, a ground state, for instance. The electron spends some of its time in the nucleus. And so the nucleus is so tiny that it can sort of probe the charge distribution around the electron. And if it were truly just a point mass without this sort of fuzz around it of virtual particles coming in and out of existence, because Heisenberg uncertainty principle applies to energy and time as well. You can borrow energy for a certain amount of time as long as it's returned, a larger amount for a smaller amount of time. And so particle antiparticle pairs are popping in and out all the time. And they become real for an instant, but they're never fully realized because they recombine and return that borrowed energy. And you'd think that this is all just total hocus pocus BS, and I would, if it weren't for the fact that you can see it in the spectrum of the hydrogen atom, that the only way you can really explain that is the electron has this fuzz around it of these polarized particles, exactly as would be predicted by this Heisenberg energy principle in the context of what particles are available and what their energies are. So you can actually do calculations to on this theory and end up matching the experiment. And so it's bizarre, but one of those things that it can happen, and so it does, and try to stop it.
Does the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that you're describing where things appear and disappear and there seems to be there's a rule and a predictability to it, does this conceptually suppose other dimensions from which these things are appearing and returning?
I don't want to say anything definitive there. I don't know that it has to. It can still just be present in a what we'd call a 3+1, 3 spatial plus 1 time dimensionality. However, there are credible ideas about what the fundamental nature of, say, an electron is that would have other compactified dimensions in which things can wiggle. And a way to see a compactified dimension is the classic example is picture an ant crawling along a power line in the distance, and it looks like it can only go one way, backwards or forward. But in reality, it can also go around. But that's just so small that from a distance, we don't perceive that dimension. So string theory, for instance, has loops of these strings that vibrate in different ways in these different dimensions, compactified dimensions, and how they vibrate determines their properties, mass and charge and spin and all those kinds of the properties of the particle, what we call a particle. And so, nobody knows if that's correct. It's an idea that has, a lot of adherence and a lot of, intriguing properties, but it's beyond our experimental means to confirm or deny. And so we're just left puzzling. And in my view, we'll never have that because modernity is going to fail. And so a
There's a
lot of things
callback.
won't happen.
Yeah.
That we're on this road of kind of progress, but that road is going to get the train track, it's going to get derailed. So there are a lot of things that we're never going to know, and there are real limits to science. I mean, we'll never. I think even if we went on for a million more years, why is there something rather than nothing? I don't think that's something that can be answered. There are realms that science can't really address. Um, big questions, and even a lot of small questions it can't address because science needs to be experimentally rooted, and there are some things that experiment just probably never can really fully penetrate. And we are limited.
Yeah.
Our window on the universe is filtered heavily by what we can sense, what we can think. And we've extended that dramatically through writing, through symbolic manipulations in a very successful way. But even that, why should we expect it to be unlimited in power and
Yeah.
insight?
Yeah. It's like we've offloaded intelligence in a way that, like the example of the cell phone, like none of us would ever know how to build a cell phone. No individual human being would ever
Mm.
know how to build that.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like our sense of reality has kind of been offloaded in a similar way. It's this collective swarm hive consciousness that's created a reality like a termite mound or something. Like no termite would know how to build it or
Right.
why the chamber is this way or that way. And
Yeah.
getting back to my book idea, the idea was to to interview experts in a half a dozen different fields
Mm.
and drill down to the point where we find out what it is, the sort of base, the bedrock of ignorance upon which that field is constructed.
Yeah. My sense is you don't have to go very far. Get a 6-year-old to do it.
Yeah,
They'll find it quickly.
exactly.
They'll find the limits.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I one of the books I read this summer that I really enjoyed was "We Will Be Jaguars" by Namonte Ninkimo and Mitch Anderson, and she describes her life as a young. Yeah, there it is.
I bought it on your recommendation.
Oh, super, right.
Yeah, yeah.
And so one thing she describes is that growing up in this Ecuadorian rainforest and Westerners coming in, missionaries and oil company people, extractive industries, would come in on airplanes and talk on radios and have brightly colored clothes and plastic and all kinds of wild stuff that was totally unfamiliar. And it seemed like magic. They seemed like gods in what they were able to do, but they didn't know how to step out of a canoe. They didn't know how to, poop and pee in the woods. They didn't know how to eat. They didn't know how to catch shrimp with their hands. There are all these examples of how is it that these people don't know? And well, maybe they know about their world. So how do you make an airplane? They don't know that either. How does that radio work? They don't know either.
Yeah,
It's like the ignorance is staggering.
yeah.
And it was a real disconnect for how can this be true? How can both things be true? They use this technology, but they don't know the first thing about it. Kind of is very insightful, I think.
Yeah, you read "Don't Sleep There Are Snakes," right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so lots of good examples. I love when they take him aside and say, "Did you know Jesus? You
Yes.
know,
Personally, have you met this guy?
yeah, did your father know him? Did your
Right.
grandfather know him? Then shut the fuck up about
Right.
Jesus." Like,
This dude's irrelevant. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, like we're in the here and now. Yeah,
Yeah.
fascinating. Well, listen, my bladder is telling me that it's time to wrap up
Okay.
episode 2. Tom, I gotta say, one of my favorite things about doing a podcast is that it gives me an excuse to sit down with people like you who, are in a totally different world, a world I've never inhabited, and to just be able to chat with you and ask you questions and explore your thinking is a real privilege for me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, likewise, I enjoy these conversations so much. And, my wife often says, don't you have somebody else to talk to about this? So, she gets tired of hearing my take on things. Not that she fundamentally disagrees, but
Start
just,
a podcast. It'll be great for your marriage.
yeah, maybe I should do that. Yeah. So I definitely enjoy our conversations because we get to places. I love the unscripted nature of it. We don't know where
Yeah.
it's going to go, but
Yeah.
it's we never find ourselves just sitting staring and saying,
That's how
no
I know it's
thoughts.
a good one.
Yeah.
I have notes but we'll start off on the first one and then we're just off and running and the frustration is there were a bunch of things that I wanted to talk about, so maybe you'll come
Mhm.
back again in the future. But
Yeah.
like books, you read really good books, really interesting books, a lot of which I've read also. So we have a lot.
One of
Uh,
them being yours, so yes.
we don't have to talk about mine, but I know you're doing a lot of reading in anthropology these days, and
Right.
really exploring that world. And I'd love to check back in with you and get your thoughts on that area.
Super.
Anyway, listen, I feel like, you know, I feel like this is the coolest thing when I get to share the birth of a friendship with the listeners of the podcast. And
Yeah, yeah,
thanks
it's
for
really
doing that,
nice.
man. I really
Absolutely.
appreciate it.